Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Schlessinger, and welcome to a water panel, uh, one of many. We're so thrilled that you're here with us. I see many, many water experts in the room, and so we may or may not keep this conversational as we go along. We'll see. I want to start by saying that Texas has always been a high water risk state. Those of you that work in water, you know that, right? We're always responding to perpetual drought or disastrous and punctuated flood. And water policy is often a response to that. In today's panel, we're going to attempt to find a new perspective, a hopeful perspective on what's going on around the state of Texas water. I think that it's frequent at this type of conference when we're thinking about things at a national scale, at an international scale, to talk about water in the terms of technology, innovation that's happening. And really, today, we want to kind of ground that down into Texas, what's happening at the institutional scale, at the governance scale, at the policy scale. We're going to examine the challenges that Texas's water supplies are facing and contemplate the way that our growth projections are impacting both urban and rural water supplies. We're going to get a little wonky with you. We're going to talk about aquifer depletion, prolonged drought, aging infrastructure, and even the important role of data as a critical piece of infrastructure about how we find a hopeful path forward in Texas's water future. So we're very pleased to have an esteemed group of water colleagues here. And one of the beautiful things about water in Texas is that if you know one of us, you know all of us. Because while Texas is very big, the water world is not that big. There are several really, really hard-working organizations and individuals and agencies that are working towards this. And so I'd like to go across and ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background and what they do, just to kind of give us a frame of context. And Scott, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Moorhead. I'm with Texas Water Trade. Texas Water Trade is a roughly 5-year-old NGO that's focused on market-based innovations to protect Texas's water for people, nature, and the economy of Texas. A little bit about me. I also have served for several years on the board of the Texas Land Conservancy, which certainly informs how I think about sort of water issues in the nexus with land use, that sort of thing. I'm in Austin, Texas. I can't really see anybody because these lights are so bright, but I can see lots of shades and apparitions. So thank you for your time. It's great to be here.
All right, thank you, Scott. My name is Sam Hermitte, and I'm with the Texas Water Development Board. We're the state agency that does water science, water planning, and water financing for the state of Texas. And I work in the water science and conservation branch of our agency. I've actually been there for, I realized, 13 years. I went as an intern when I was getting my grad degree, thinking I would just be an intern and then I would leave and go on and do other things, but it's a very interesting place to be and a very mission-driven agency. Our mission is to ensure a secure water future for Texas, which is, you know, where the rubber meets the road, and so the fact that I get to work on that every day is really exciting.
Oh, you got one. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Puig-Williams, and I work for Environmental Defense Fund. I lead our water program here in Texas, and EDF is a global NGO working on all sorts of climate-related issues. But as I said, I work on water here in Texas and specifically on groundwater sustainability issues. So I'm really excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Sarah, it's great to be here. Pam, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm Jeremy Mazer with Texas 2036. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, data-driven policy think tank. Our North Star is to make Texas the best place to live and work by the year of our bicentennial, that is in 2036. I've worked in or with the legislature for over 25 years, with the majority of them on water policy in both the Texas House, Texas Senate, as well as the Director of Government Relations for two agencies that are essential for our state's water future, both the Water Development Board and the Railroad Commission. The great news is we're about to have a historic water session, and I look forward to talking about that more over the next 54 minutes.
Well, don't jinx it, Jeremy. And I forgot to mention, I run Texas Water Foundation. We're a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit that works in the areas of water policy and workforce and leadership initiatives, and we're building a statewide water awareness campaign. So as Jeremy said, finally and at last, while Texas has always been interested in water, and finally and at last, we have prioritized water security at the leadership level. And so if you're new to Texas, know that we are currently in the middle of a legislative session. So if all of us look a little tired and our eyes are twitching, that's the reason. And finally and at last, we're taking water very seriously. The governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker have all indicated water as being in water infrastructure, and water infrastructure funding in particular as being an emergency priority item. And so to kind of give us a frame on the state of Texas water, where are we in this moment? Why is this moment so critical? We want to kind of start to describe it from each of our lanes. And Sam, I wondered from a state agency perspective, Texas Water Development Board is a non-regulatory state agency, right? But you do the planning, the funding, very importantly, and the science for how we plan for our supply and demand. What's the state seeing in terms of our supply and demand projections and Texas's water future?
Thanks, Sarah. Great question. So just to give folks a little bit of context on the agency and what we do, our agency started out of the drought of the 1950s. So for those, again, not from Texas or who haven't been here for a long time, the 1950s was a really historic drought that was really difficult for the state to work through. And after that, legislators got together and said, okay, we don't want this to happen again, where our various sectors of the economy really suffered through, agriculture, a lot of devastation. And so they developed a statewide planning process. And for a long time, that planning process was done at the state level. But Texas is very much a bottom-up kind of state where the preference is to have decisions made locally in many cases, not in all. And so in 1997, the state shifted to a regional water planning process. And that's a process that repeats every 5 years and looks 50 years into the future. So the most recent plan that came out was in 2022. And in terms of what we're seeing right now is the Texas Miracle, which is fueled by lots and lots and lots of folks coming to the state of Texas. So we're looking at a 73% increase in the state's population over 50 years. So that's going from, and I had to jot down my numbers so I wouldn't forget them, going from about 29.7 million folks in 2020 to just over 51 million folks in 2070. So that is the backdrop behind all of these conversations and all of these discussions. That is what looms larger than anything else. And so as part of the state water planning process, in addition to, population projections, we also look at, okay, well, how are our demands going to change over time? Even though we're increasing by 73% in terms of population, we're increasing by 9% in terms of demand because there's increased conservation, increased efficiency over time. But then that increase in demand is also walking alongside a decrease in supply. You'll hear from our expert Vanessa on groundwater, and we're depleting the state's groundwater resources in different ways, different time scales, but we're looking at an 18% decrease in supply that is primarily caused by groundwater reduction. So you've got a 9% increase in demand, the 18% decrease in supply, and then that is going to leave a gap or a lot of needs. And so the planning process is to identify, again, through these regional planning groups, how to meet those needs going forward. And so that's really what we're looking at and what we're focused on, and is getting the funding in place to actually implement the strategies that are in the plan. And I will just note a couple more things because I think it's really important for really understanding the significance of the context. In 2070, roughly a third of those additional supplies are supposed to come from conservation. So it's really important to understand that conservation is a key part of what we're doing in Texas and that we have to carry that forward in order to meet our needs going forward. And this is under drought conditions. This is not under like blue skies, lots of rainy days. This is under drought conditions. And if we don't really work to enhance the state's infrastructure and supply, we'd be looking at a quarter of the Texas population having less than half of the municipal supply needed under drought of record conditions. So we've got a lot to think about as we experience the Texas Miracle.
And if I'm not mistaken, that 70% population growth is largely projected to go towards our urban growth corridors, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so we've got a kind of slightly wonky distribution of where that population is increasing. So Jeremy, We discussed the Texas miracle. Texas's ranking in the global economies is currently
7, lucky 7.
lucky 7. Good
or
for
it's
us.
about to be lucky 7.
That's right. Premised entirely in the availability of water. And so I guess, Sam gave us a little bit of the forecast on supply and demand projections. Why suddenly and at last are leadership paying attention to water availability and infrastructure investment?
So I like to say, this legislature likes bright, shiny objects. And one of the objects they really like is this thing called the Texas economic miracle. They're seeing things happen in their district that hasn't happened in Texas for decades. Population growth, manufacturing booms, economic growth and development. They like this, and they know that there's 3 things that need to be in place for this to happen. The first is a dependable electric grid. That's why you're hearing them talking about having a reliable electric generation. Second thing is a qualified, competent workforce. But the third thing is a reliable water infrastructure across the state. And so they know that if they want to have this thing called the Texas economic miracle continue for the next 50 years, or at least until 2036, which would be great for us, they have to have reliable water infrastructure in place. But there's 2 challenges here. The first one, as Sam expertly navigated you through, is we face a long-term water supply deficit if we don't expand our water supply portfolio and we're hit by a long, severe drought. Remember that drought is really the enemy in Texas. I'm going to hopefully say that again. But the second problem that we're facing, the second challenge that we're facing, has to do with this problem of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are becoming liabilities to the communities that they serve. And so this legislature, they want the economic growth and development. They want the Texas economic miracle. But at the same time, they're recognizing that we don't necessarily have the reliable water infrastructure in place for us to continue. And I think that's why it's a big topic in 2025.
And are we currently in drought?
Some areas of the state certainly are in drought. I mean, certainly west of I-35, it's almost, 100 years ago, the state meteorologist said Texas is a land of perpetual drought, visited by the occasional biblical flood. And if you live west of I-35, that's perpetually true, except for the one weekend where it rains. And there are some areas in the state, particularly in West Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, in San Antonio to Austin, where the drought conditions have been persistent, and that's troubling.
And certainly has contributed to why there's such political attention right now because of its economic impact, right, and projections. Now, I know it rained this morning and rained with intensity, but we are in significant and severe drought. And one of the notes that I want to make, going back to Sam, is that as we look at the water supply projections that are needed and the amount of conservation, it's not just conservation, it's conservation, efficiency, and reuse, right? And some of that efficiency necessarily needs to come from our infrastructure being repaired and made to be more efficient. So, Vanessa, you have characterized and coined a really fun new way of thinking about infrastructure, because infrastructure is both built and natural, and in some cases things like aquifers. You came up with the hashtag aquifers are infrastructure too, right? What's the state of groundwater relative to our overall water portfolio, and how are these population dynamics impacting it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to say about groundwater, and that I feel like I end up doing a lot in my work, is making something invisible visible. Because you can't really protect something that you can't see. And that's the question. How do you protect something you can't see? And so a lot of what I do is storytelling with people who are impacted by declining groundwater levels. And that's often rural communities. And I also talk a lot about the need for data and science, because that's actually how you visualize what's happening in these aquifer systems that you can't see. And so I think oftentimes aquifers and groundwater, that's within these aquifer systems kind of get left out of the conversation. I don't necessarily think that's always intentional, and I'll share later why I think that that's hopefully changing. But yeah, we need to rely on good data. And right now the data is telling us that the aquifers across the state are declining. And particularly in these areas that are outside of urban centers. So Sarah mentioned that most of the growth in Texas is happening in our urban core. But the state demographer actually has shared that most of that growth is occurring in the counties surrounding our urban cores. So that's in what I think a lot of us city dwellers still think of as the country. Maybe not maybe not so much like deep in the heart, but it's still rural, and it's where people are depending on groundwater for their drinking water supplies. Groundwater provides 99% of the drinking water supplies in rural communities. So it is very important that we continue to look at how we protect that through data and through good policy.
And from a statewide perspective, groundwater constitutes a significant portion of our overall water budget, correct?
Yes, it's about 55% of the total water supply in the state comes from groundwater. Agriculture uses close to 80%. And one thing that I think a lot of people also don't realize is that groundwater is a significant source of water for our rivers and streams. The Water Development Board, Sam's shop, has estimated that an average of 30% of the water flowing in our rivers actually comes from groundwater. Of course, during drought, that's going to be 100% often. And so, again, we need to be managing it to make sure that that drinking water is available, that water is there for agriculture, and that we can continue to rely on it for our spring and base flow.
Perfect segue, because of course, in addition to aquifers being a critical part of our natural infrastructure, so too are our rivers and streams and healthy bays and estuaries. Dr. Yaskowitz made me aware of the fact that part of Texas's economic miracle is also its very rich coastal economy. And I think that people often overlook that in terms of Texas's fabric. So Scott, turning to you and thinking about the role of maintaining what we refer to as environmental flows, how are you seeing the state of affairs in the availability of water in our natural ecosystems?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough question. I mean, writ large, as we've said, we are a naturally drought-prone state, and we swing from extreme to extreme. And we talked about the drought of record in the 1950s. The drought of record was broken by floods in 1957. So we can go from very meager to very our cup runneth over conditions in a really short period of time. And so, we sometimes say that while water scarcity is a global phenomenon, it manifests itself in very local ways. And so it's very difficult to say, environmental flows or in-stream flows are this or that, because as we've said, the challenge manifests itself differently across the state. I mean, I think I heard in the land panel this morning with James something like 3 of the last 16 years in far west Texas have been above average precipitation. As we're probably mostly aware in this room, I mean, Texas is an unusual animal in that many of our surface water systems originate in the state of Texas. So the headwaters, the start of those systems is by and large in the state of Texas, and then they by and large terminate along the Texas Gulf Coast.
From springs. They start from springs. See, it all goes back to groundwater.
When was the last time
y'all... When
was the last time everybody looked at the water cycle? Remember that thing we learned as kids? I want you to conjure that image right now.
Well, so a rambling answer to the question, but we have stream flow challenges that are manifesting themselves differently across the state. So we talked a little bit about drought west of I-35, and a lot of those systems are heavily groundwater dependent. As Vanessa mentioned, sometimes during really dry conditions, inflows to those systems may be very dependent on groundwater. And if you go out into some of those systems over the past few years during the drought that we're currently in, the surface flows in those systems can be pretty meager. The challenge too, and again, we'll talk about this later on the infrastructure side, but if you think about the state of Texas, I think something like we have 200 or so reservoirs across the state of Texas, all of which are impounded. So I know we think of rivers and streams as these systems that are like these wild, unfettered things, but in reality, I mean, we have reservoirs, we have infrastructure, we have releases from this human-engineered infrastructure that then create, among other things, environmental flows, but the management of those systems is exquisitely complex. And so we are managing those systems to satisfy the needs of all sorts of different user groups, whether that's municipal water, industrial water, agricultural water, mining water, et cetera. Environment is often kind of a last in line sort of user group in many respects. And so I think part of the challenge that we have on stream flows, we have to just recharacterize how we think of environmental water. When I think of environmental water, it's just water. And it's water that supports the entirety of the state's economy and the engine that drives the state's economy. We'll talk about bays and estuaries a little bit. our bays and estuaries are really the gemstones of the Texas coast and support an incredible abundance, not only of wildlife and ecology and habitat, but they also, of course, protect our industry. They protect our physical assets along the Gulf Coast when we have big hurricanes, when we have big storm surge. The health of those systems is critical to attenuating, for example, storm surge or managing flood control. Coastal Prairie Conservancy, Mary Ann talked about that a little bit. Just when we have intact natural systems, those natural systems are a bulwark against the built infrastructure of the state. And so it's really important that we think, I think, in a more integrated way about the health of these systems and of the opportunity set that we have. Our bays and estuaries, in many respects, are challenged by things like effectively relative sea level rise. So Texas has some of the highest rates of relative sea level rise across the United States. That's a combination, effectively, of things like groundwater pumping, which is causing subsidence. But the encroachment of that salt water is a significant challenge to the health of our bays and estuaries. And then when you couple that with reduced freshwater inflows into those same systems, these are systems that are beset by multiple stressors. And so we really have to think integratedly as a community to kind of meld all these different disciplines together, because you can't decouple all of these systems from one another.
Yeah. It occurs to me that if some of you are thinking, why in the world are we talking about infrastructure at a conservation-oriented conference? And I think it's because if there's an opportunity, a hopeful opportunity to think about these systems, built and natural and human and data, as a part of a solution forward. And Texas is, I like to say, ironically progressive, in that we do embrace some of these opportunities, and really in this moment are taking very seriously the concept of water infrastructure and water security. In the case of endangered species, did you know that they find the charismatic megafauna in order to bolster enthusiasm around a particular initiative? Well, it turns out, to Vanessa's point around groundwater, infrastructure is not exactly charismatic. It's often invisible, it's not particularly sexy, and so I think that there's an effort right now to kind of recharacterize how we think about data. And so the state of Texas water is, we've got too many people coming, not enough supply. We've got aging and deteriorating infrastructure. Our groundwaters are being depleted, and our environmental flows are non-existent. Right, great. Let's turn hopeful. Let's think about, so Sam, data as infrastructure, and I'm gonna ask you to hand this over. Can you talk to us a little bit about what Texas has been doing to invest in the way that we understand and manage more effectively our resources?
Sure, and data is infrastructure, just like aquifers. I think we need to have a much more expansive view of what we consider as infrastructure, and that's a really important piece of it. And Texas, there's the saying that you manage what you measure, and so if you don't measure it, you can't manage it effectively. And so we strive to improve how effectively and accurately we measure the states and can quantify the state's water resources. We do that through groundwater availability modeling our state's brackish groundwater resources. And, Vanessa, I know we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are limitations to how much one entity can do and at what scale you can model. And so, we're looking at the regional scale or at the statewide scale. We're not looking at the individual well level scale. But in addition to those kinds of efforts, we work to quantify the state's water losses, so to the point of aging infrastructure and how important the connection between data and the initiatives that are taking place and will take place in the future. Data have to underlie those decisions. And so we collect information on the state's water losses. Every entity submits that information to us, and as a public organization, we really strive to make the data and the science that we collect easily findable and accessible to the public. And so some colleagues in the environmental sector, they put together a report telling the story of water loss in Texas and how...
What is water loss?
Thank you, sorry, I forget about that. So water loss is literally the water coming physically out of pipes as it is being conveyed to end users. So as it's being conveyed to your homes, as it's being conveyed to businesses, there are other kinds of water loss as well, but for this this purpose and this conversation, it's really the physical loss of water from the pipes as it's in transit. And, you know, the numbers and, you know, you could look at it as sort of averages out to around 50 gallons per connection, so per endpoint per day across the state. I mean, these are phenomenal volumes. And so these colleagues at a different entity, an environmental organization, put together a very compelling report that then was shared with the legislature, among others. And I think, you know, and Jeremy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was really critical in driving the legislature to award $1 billion. We'll put it before the voters, who then opted to make that choice in Texas to go to the Texas Water Development Board with water loss and conservation being prioritized in this new funding mechanism. And so that's a really good example of the importance of data in our decision making as a state. And one other piece I want to mention on the data side of things, I forgot to mention in my introduction that I'm also part of the Internet of Water Coalition, which is a national effort to really make data more findable so you can get to it, more accessible so you can pull it down to make decisions, interoperable so you can use it with other types of data to enhance your decision making, to enhance the information you can develop, and reusable so someone else can go back and take that same data set and do it again. So that's sort of the broad concept. But in Texas, one of the things that we're doing is developing a water data hub, which I like to, and you know, since we're up here being the like non-sexy policy wonks, it's a card catalog for water data, for those who remember card catalogs. But it's a place where, you know, as we get more folks to contribute, and it's voluntary because we don't like to use a stick, we prefer to use a carrot. It's voluntary for entities to share their data with us so we can put it in the hub and make it accessible to others so that we can have data-driven decisions, which are the best kind of decisions. I mean, all your healthcare decisions are data-driven decisions. Your decision of whether or not to take an umbrella when you leave in the morning and go outside, that's a data-driven decision. You know, our decisions are better when they're data-driven, and so those are some of the things that we're doing.
And it's a big deal that this water hub is being built at Texas Water Development Board, that the legislature has funded those initiatives, that philanthropic efforts have funded those initiatives. So going on the water loss, and Jeremy, coming over to infrastructure again, built infrastructure. What are the numbers we're looking at here? I mean, not just water loss, but how much do we need to invest to repair this aging infrastructure?
And I think that is the billion-dollar question in front of this legislature right now. So we've heard about the need to expand and diversify our water supply portfolio. We've talked about the problems of aging, deteriorating water systems. We project that the state is going to need to invest at least $154 billion with a B dollars over the next 50 years towards addressing these issues. The good news is that there's already existing state and federal financial assistance programs that'll probably work to finance some of that $154 billion. We don't know how the feds are going to blow up their financial assistance, but assuming that things stay the same, which is a big assumption right now, we're projecting a long-term water infrastructure funding gap of about $112 billion over the next 50 years. This doesn't have to be spent tomorrow or next year, but what we're telling the legislature is that if you want this economic growth to continue, if you want to solve these problems with regard to water supply and failing systems, you need to come up with a plan to invest at least $112 billion in water infrastructure over the next 50 years. And so that's what makes this the billion-dollar water session.
At least $1 billion is our hope. And I'm sorry, Jeremy, I want to go back also on drought, because I know that y'all did a study just recently that also looked at what the economic impact of drought is on the state. So not just the aging infrastructure needs, but it's significant, right? As you look at water availability plus aging infrastructure plus drought, there's huge economic hits on that.
Yeah, we know what we need to spend in order to fix the problem, and we're aware generally of these problems. But there are substantial economic consequences if we don't address these problems. For example, if we don't fix the problem with aging, deteriorating, leaking, drinking water and wastewater systems, that's going to cost our state's economy a total of $320 billion over the next 50 years. And for comparison, that is just about the size of the 2-year state budget the legislature is on track to pass this session. When it comes to droughts impacts, although this is discussed in the Water Development Board's most recent state water plan, when we adjust those data for inflation and look at the impacts to other key sectors of our state's economy, we're looking at annual economic losses, annual GDP losses that significantly exceed those that the state of Texas endured during the Great Recession and the COVID pandemic. We're talking about upwards of $165 billion in GDP losses per year if we don't have enough water for the next long, severe drought.
So very compelling argument. Obviously, it was easy to make the argument for the impact that it'll have on our economy. Harder to make the argument sometimes when we're talking about ecosystem services. And so, Scott, I want to turn it back over to you. Texas Water Trade utilizes also voluntary actions, right, to create a water market system. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the economic hit is, investment opportunity, as you look at the environmental flows section of our water supply?
Yes, but I do want to just push back. I've agreed with everything that has been said on this panel, with the one exception that water is indeed sexy. It is. Okay. It's like some are arrested development here.
It's a dry topic.
Fat bucket. Well, so ecosystem services and valuation of water, it's interesting. So Vanessa kind of hit on this at the get, which is it's very difficult to appreciate or place a value, intrinsic or otherwise, on something that is so occult and so difficult to discern. You turn on your tap, it's there. So how do we think about that? That's a question we think about a lot, and I think it's especially, as Sarah says, it's especially difficult when you start to think about things like ecosystem services and all of the things that the natural world, the stacked benefits, you sometimes hear it said, the things that intact ecosystems provide to human communities. And of course, you know, a secondary piece of that is what they provide to the natural critters that rely on them, that then enable the economies and the quality of life that human communities do in fact enjoy. And so, you know, we think about this a lot. In an earlier presentation, Dr. Lopez was here, and he's done some really interesting work that look at the value of ecosystem services of intact lands, and importantly, what part of that work shows is that in some places in the state, more than half of the value of a functioning rangeland, privately managed ranchland or farm, intact forests, more than half of that can really inure to water supply, for example. So we often think about water quality, but we often forget that water supply is massively impacted by the ecosystem services that our natural world provides. And of course, as Texas increasingly urbanizes, particularly in places like the Texas Triangle, the value of those ecosystem services only goes up even as it becomes more and more difficult for them to be delivered. And so, you know, we think a lot about not just how to value water, but also what is the cost of not having it, and what is the cost of these systems. And of course, that's the drought question. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is that as industry and additional business comes to the state, folks are getting far savvier about what the cost of not having water is. And of course, with respect to our ecology and our natural systems, it's a huge, huge challenge. You know, for example, if you think about our bays and estuaries, and you think about the role that they play, not only in our economy, but in ecotourism. I mean, ecotourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry along the state of Texas's coast. You've got folks. I used to work at Audubon, Texas. Birders are insane. They're just crazy. I mean, people.
Like in a good way?
Yes, but in a way that is also secret and occult to me. I kid. I also can only identify 10 birds, Marianne. But if you think about the major Gulf cuts, I mean, a lot of the critters that we rely on for recreational fishing or for just to undergird the food chain, you know, the life stages of those systems, a lot of these organisms will spend time in the Gulf, and they'll spawn in the Gulf, but then the larvae need to go up into the upper estuary in order to be successful. And when you strangulate freshwater inflows to your bays and estuaries, not deliberately, but through a combination of stressors like drought and many, many consumptive needs that are up and down these systems, then you inadvertently are putting these systems under extraordinary stress. The other thing I will continue to come back on is that, you know, we think about rivers and streams and bays and estuaries as these wild, you know, untouched things, but they're not. That's the Texas Gulf Coast is a highly engineered system. All of our waterways, as I said earlier, these are systems that have seen a lot of impacts from human development, and with the pace of growth that we have now in the state of Texas, I mean, every single new project changes the water budget and changes the way that a system is going to behave, maybe because there's more runoff or there's a new demand that's placed on a system here that's then going to impact 300 miles of river stream downstream. And so you really have to look at these things, as I said earlier, as a collective. And we've got to get better as a community of practice in how we value those services and make the compelling economic argument, I think, for why they're so deserving of greater attention and greater protection. At Texas Water Trade, we're very focused on how we will incentivize those sorts of behaviors, and so a lot of our work involves trying to build coalitions of the willing, so industry partners, private landowners, other NGOs who are expert in their field in biology or the other sciences, where we can make that compelling leaning on data, generating data, showing the value of the investment thesis to say we haven't fully appreciated how critical this is to our community and to our economy and to these systems. We need to do a better job of protecting it. We need to do a better job bringing capital to bear to solve these problems.
I appreciate you bringing up the stacked benefits piece of it, because there's also stacked impacts, right? As we think about the water cycle, and I think about the role of aquifers as infrastructure all the way down to our bays and estuaries. I want to turn us to this moment that we're in Texas history, because it is significant and unique in that we are looking very specifically at water infrastructure with all of its nuance and the ability to fund it in a dare I say sustainable way. Should I say that? I can't say that. Jeremy, or rather Vanessa, as we kind of bridge over to it, thinking about the role of aquifers, what is it that you hope for in terms of funding an appropriate amount of data for their adequate management?
Yeah, so I mean, the phrase aquifers are infrastructure was sort of born out of this recognition that from last session, really, where the legislature was considering making this one-time appropriation to jumpstart, water supply development and infrastructure improvements of $1 billion. And, I began to think, well, what about aquifers? Because when you compare what the state has invested in groundwater management, and that includes the development of data and modeling that helps groundwater conservation districts make decisions, it's just so much less. Just a little bit of a 101 on groundwater in Texas. It's managed bottom up. It's managed by local groundwater conservation districts, and they're often small in some cases and don't have huge budgets, and they are doing the best they can with the resources they have to represent the people who live in their district that depend on that groundwater. And so, they need access to data to make good decisions, and that entails funding. And so, I felt that there was really a need for the state to increase investments, not only for groundwater districts, but also the Water Development Board, which plays a huge role, as Sam explained, in developing more regional data and modeling. And the board's groundwater division, their budget is significantly smaller, I think, than some of the other divisions that the state has. So, I don't want to make it sound like groundwater is just always kind of like getting left out, but it sure feels that way. And so I feel like that's a big part of my job, is to advocate for groundwater protection and funding, and on behalf of groundwater districts across the state. So we have been working very closely with Representative Cody Harris at the Texas legislature. He's chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. And he recognized, even though he comes from water-rich East Texas, that there are even impacts in his communities from large groundwater pumping, and that more data to make decisions about how you manage that groundwater in the long term is really important. So he has sponsored legislation that would actually create a groundwater research, science, and innovation fund. That would be a grant program for groundwater districts. We're only asking for $15 million, which sounds like nothing, but it's actually, when you, in the scheme of things, a huge help, because science doesn't always cost that much money. We don't need to necessarily invest $1 billion a year in science, but we need to invest more. And so this I see is a first step in that.
So what if we did invest $1 billion a year into water infrastructure? Jeremy, let's talk a little bit about this moment and what's being contemplated and why is it unique?
Okay, so we're going to do a quick legislative update. For those of you that are watching, congratulations. We've passed the 100-day threshold of a 140-day legislative session. That means we have 40. Yes, I heard that. That means we have 40 days to go, which means there's a lot of political balderdash that can happen over the next 40 days. I wanted to use another word. There is a major package underway that'll set up a $1 billion per fiscal year revenue dedication to the Texas Water Fund. And this can be used to build the water infrastructure we need, your new water supplies, fixing your aging deteriorating systems, hopefully funding some groundwater science. But 40 days goes like a snap in the legislative calendar. And we're starting to see some political issues in the House and the Senate, with some things not being heard just yet. And we're running out of time. And time is the most precious element of any 140-day legislative session. But there is strong political support, as Sarah said, from state leadership, as well as from a coalition of over 140 chambers of commerce and trade organizations that support consistent, dedicated funding for water. And so even though the clock's running precipitously low, and there's a lot of political shenanigans and balderdash about to happen, we're really hopeful by the end of this session, the legislature will propose an amendment that you all can vote on in November that will propose amending the Texas Constitution to create a $1 billion per year revenue stream to the Texas Water Fund. And so that is the big issue right now with the legislature.
And for comparison, Jeremy, how have we funded our roads and bridges in Texas?
Well, we already do this funding model for roads and highways. And as Dr. Yaskowitz knows with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, in 2019, the legislature and state voters also approved a state sporting goods sales tax dedication to state parks and historic sites. This is a funding model that the legislature and voters have embraced before by wide margins, and it's really proven to work to solve our problems.
So that feels rather hopeful to me. I think you also have some data that indicates that Texas voters, by and large, support investment in water and prioritization of it.
Totally. The polling number here is robust. I mean, when we, at Texas 2036, we do this thing called the Texas Voter Poll. We ask voters about a bunch of things, like, what's your confidence in the state legislature? What do you think about healthcare? What do you think about water? Is Bigfoot real? We've also asked them questions about what they think about dedicated funding for water. And 85% of registered voters said that they would certainly support funding for water, which indicates that water is really a substantial concern for all regions of the state.
Well, that is good news, particularly because I think that underneath this conversation, there's a very real conversation about how we fund these different pieces of infrastructure, right? And by and large, the built infrastructure that we rely upon for our water security is funded through our water bill, right? It's ratepayers. And so the fact that the state is having a conversation about front-loading an investment into its water supply and water security in order to subsidize and finance water infrastructure is a really big deal. And it's a really big moment in Texas history generally, and I just want to make sure to pause to appreciate that. Sam, coming back over to you, when we keep talking about hope and positive trends, what are some other positive trends that we're seeing in terms of data and science in Texas? Can you speak to that?
Well, I would say in general, sort of positive trends are a greater appreciation for science and data. I mean, the fact that Vanessa is here advocating for financing for the science to better inform what we're doing in the groundwater space and be able to more accurately and precisely, like not at a regional scale, at a local scale, characterize our resources. That's a really positive step. The fact that we have a Texas Water Data Hub. The fact that almost everyone on this panel has mentioned data as being an important piece of the puzzle. I think we're just seeing a general trend into really using the data and information that are made available in decision making. And I would say that's probably the biggest positive trend. And we continue to make incremental progress, really, I would say every legislative session. It was, I don't know, maybe about a decade ago, we started characterizing the state's brackish groundwater resources, because originally we were just characterizing freshwater resources. And so we've been working on that. Now we're also working in aquifer storage and recovery to identify areas that are suitable in aquifer storage and recovery. So the aquifers that Vanessa has been talking about, you know, groundwater that's underground in different types of substrate, whether it's sandy or it's rocky, they all have different characteristics that make them more or less suitable for pumping. Like, there's natural infiltration, but what we're really talking about is pumping water underground so that it will stay and hang out, and you can take it back out later when you need it, like during a drought. And San Antonio has done this very robustly for a long period of time, but now we're looking at other parts of the state to see, okay, where else can we use aquifer storage and recovery? And so I think we're seeing it just broadly help us diversify our portfolio, and really, in terms of tools in the toolbox for trying to address the state's water challenges. You know, when we look at things like rainwater harvesting and evaporation, we're trying to really improve how the state is quantifying its evaporation estimates, because those can be huge. We lose more water to evaporation in dry years than to municipal consumption. Like, let that sit with you for a minute. And if we are not accurately quantifying evaporation, then the whole conversation is off base. Like, we have to have that accurately characterized to really know what we're talking about. So I think we are and have been making progress in a lot of different directions that all get back to really understanding the state's water resources and making that information available to decision makers across sectors, you know, not just legislators, local decision makers, folks that are you know, proposing funding for various types of activities. It's information that everyone can use. And so I think in addition to gathering more data, it's also making sure that it's available to the public, and it's easy to get to, it's easy to find, and it's easy to understand. There's been a shift, and I'll wrap up so other people can talk too, but to focusing on the user experience. And generally that's something that has been much more private sector than public sector, in terms of when you go to a website, how easy to understand is it? How can you get to what you want quickly and really be able to answer the question that you had that drove you to that site initially? And government historically has not been real great at that. And I think we're getting better, which is really important.
So you're saying you're making Water Data Hub sexy again?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wasn't trying to say water wasn't sexy. I was saying like water wonky.
She's saying we aren't.
Yeah, maybe.
Wonderful. And just to kind of draw out, you know, what I'm hearing you say, Sam, is as we invest more time, resources, energy, workforce into the data and the science and monitoring of our water supply, it allows you to inform the types of strategies are then being funded by this, hopefully, injection of funding that's coming, right? So thinking about smarter distribution. And I really appreciate bringing up the evaporation rate, right? Evaporation and St. Augustine grass are our two biggest users. So coming back over to you, Scott, when you think about opportunities for collaboration, opportunities for efficiency between and across industries, and I'm thinking about this data, right? Smarter allocation. What are you seeing, particularly as you look at the regional playbook over on I was going to say this side, the east side of Texas?
Yeah, it's. Well, I think Sam's point persists, which is as data becomes more broadly available, and I think as more of us become accustomed to the leverage of data in the commission of our work, one, we're getting, I would like to think that we're getting smarter in how we manage these things, and I think what you're also seeing is that there is a common appetite for those sorts of data to be leveraged so that our investments in these sorts of capital and natural capital assets are in fact protected. So when our firm, for example, works with state agencies, which we do, local river authorities, which we do, corporate actors, which we do, local NGOs with deep technical and sort of natural field expertise, the generation of and then also the application of data, I think we're seeing how important it is, because folks who are funding the work expect that. They expect us to be using these tools. And are pleased when we are able to demonstrate not only that we are using them, that potentially that the work that is happening itself is improving the data that are then being used to make future decisions. I mean, we hear about AI and garbage in, garbage out. So it's not as though any of these data are static sets that just sit there on a shelf and we grab from them. I mean, science is the pursuit and the improvement of all that information that we're commonly using to sort of drive investment and also understand where the state's greatest needs are across this sort of work. Go ahead. On a regional scale, for example, a lot of our work is centered along the Texas coast and then increasingly in the Texas Hill Country and far west Texas. I think more than anything, and this maybe is jumping the gun a little bit, but I'm looking at the clock here. There's so much growth coming into the state, but that brings massive challenges, don't get me wrong, but it also presents extraordinary opportunity for, again, the coalitions of the willing. So, corporations as they come here are bringing significant demands on resources, including water, but they're also potentially bringing an appetite for how they can make their new communities better places to live. More durable places to live. Nobody comes into the state expecting to build a stranded asset. And so that's an opportunity set for collaboration that, in my mind, it expresses itself differently at the regional scale because different regions of the state are really seeing very different stressor sets. But I see that as an enormous opportunity for the folks who want to get together in the room and figure out how we're going to fix stuff.
Vanessa, there's a tendency when people are new to water in Texas to look at how groundwater is managed and think that feels very like Wild West out there. And I wonder if you could share where you think there are positive developments and things to be really proud of in the groundwater field in Texas. What are the moments for hope in terms of what's changing and evolving in the groundwater sector?
Well, I love working on groundwater issues because it's such a challenge. I'm an attorney, and so it's cool because the law is really unclear. So there's a lot to argue about.
Sounds very lucrative.
And try to figure out. But it also means that there's a lot of space for policy improvements too. So y'all know that groundwater is privately owned in Texas, and so that fundamentally impacts how it's managed. It puts groundwater conservation districts in a really awkward and challenging place because they're having to manage a resource that is simultaneously shared by users across the aquifer systems, but also privately owned. So they're always trying to figure out how to do that. What I have noticed in probably the last 10 years that I've really focused on groundwater is that we are seeing more and more groups that I would have said 10 years ago were staunchly opposed to even engaging in groundwater because of the fear that that means we're going to somehow infringe on property rights, recognizing that we actually have to be proactive about managing this resource. And so in the legislation that we've been working on to create this fund, we've been able to build a really strong and diverse coalition of organizations from, I see James Oliver over there, the Southwestern Cattle Raisers, to the Farm Bureau, to environmental groups. That has been incredible. And that didn't happen 10 years ago. And the fact that we're seeing very conservative members of the legislature, like Senator Charles Perry from the Lubbock area, who chairs our Senate Water Committee, who's the sponsor, for this big water bill that Jeremy talked about, also introducing legislation that I think does some really positive things to support local groundwater management, when in the past, I think that would have been viewed as, just, again, infringing on property rights. That gives me incredible hope. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that's driven by drought, but that's how we make water policy in Texas. And so I guess sometimes drought, there's a little hope in there that maybe it will show us and teach us, that we need to make better decisions. But yeah, that would be my answer.
Well, that's lovely. So the state of Texas water, of course, is that things, there's high pressure, there's high stakes, but it doesn't feel bleak. In fact, it feels between the collaboration and the data and the policy opportunities that are very much real and present, that there's a glide path towards Texas hopefully continuing to be ironically progressive, as I say, in securing its water future. And so as we close, I wanted to ask if each of the panelists wanted to share the one thing that gives them the most hope for the remainder of how many days? 40? 40 days. For the remainder of the year. And Scott, I'll start with you. What gives you the most hope?
The collaboration thing is real, and I would say that that's a key piece of this. I'm cheating. I'm going to answer two things. Definitely the collaboration. I just think the urgency of the moment and the fact that when you scrape all the garbage aside for a second and you compare your interests to my interests, to her interests, to his interests, they're by and large co-located, and so the opportunity to collaborate because we are all able to see the writing on the wall and the urgency of the moment gives me hope. We're an entrepreneurial people in this state, and this is a state that is built on entrepreneurship and that idea, and Texans can figure stuff out, so we're going to figure this stuff out, but we're going to do it together, we're going to fail together. The other one was just kids.
Just kids?
Yeah, they care about this stuff. They see the world very differently than we do, and they're so damn smart. And I've got 2 kids. That's what I'm thinking about.
Thanks, Scott. I'm just going to say what Scott said, which is really the people and collaboration. And I'll bring in the flood side of things because we've been having a drought-centric conversation, but it's really the same on the flood side, too. And flood is huge in Texas. I mean, literally, Hurricane Harvey, they had to add a new color to the National Weather Service's color ramp because of the concentration of rain in a 24-hour period. But the type of collaboration that Scott's talking about is also happening in the flood space. So the fact that there's this kind of collaboration across the hydrologic cycle that Sarah referred to earlier, that is data-driven, that is allowing for the types of conversations that Vanessa was describing that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, the entrepreneurial spirit, all of that coming together. It's really people-driven, and it's going to be people that are going to solve these problems. And I think we have what we need, and Texas has great resources because of its natural resources that support the economy and allow for us to take bold action. And so I think in the legislature, the moment that Jeremy was describing. So I really think it's the people. And I also have 2 kids. I'm with you there. Kids.
Well, I disagree with that phrase, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting.
I thought you were going to disagree with her.
No. No, I don't disagree.
spicy at
I
the end.
disagree with the phrase, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting, because I really do think water is unifying. And I've seen that firsthand and on all of my work. And so in addition to working at the legislature, which often doesn't feel very hopeful, a lot of work I do is with communities. And we've got a really cool project out in West Texas where we're bringing together a lot of different stakeholders to come up with solutions to preserve flow at San Solomon Springs, where Balmorhea State Park is. And we've had really awesome meetings this past year, and it just is amazing to me and so hopeful to see such a diverse group of people come together with very different perspectives who are working together to try to solve this one problem. So that brings me hope.
What gives me hope is something has clearly clicked with the legislature that's never clicked before. Every time we had a major water session, it was because of a lawsuit or a major drought. But here they are in the first time in recorded history, taking action to do something meaningful and historic about water. because something's clicked, and they see that if you want to have this Texas economic miracle, you have to have water infrastructure. So that's what gives me hope.
I love it. Well, in closing, it's funny, often people want to talk about technology and innovation to solve our water security issues, but it's almost never about that. It's always about people. It's always about people. It's always about governance. It's always about policy. Join me in thanking this wonderful panel.